Good afternoon. My name is Scott Newstock, and I'm the Executive Director of the Spence Wilson Center for the Humanities. I find it incredibly heartening to see so many familiar faces here, as well as new faces, people who love the humanities, and more importantly, people who love freedom. I'm grateful for the many faculty, staff, and students, as well as my family and friends who helped make this event possible. Before introducing our speaker, however, I want to take a moment to acknowledge Spence Wilson for his support of Rhodes and his love of the humanities. As an undergraduate, please, yes, go ahead. As an undergraduate, Spence's curiosity was sparked by his philosophy professor, John Compton, who maintained that the most exciting thing in life is to try to enhance our understanding of the human condition. It was in this spirit that Spence established a Wilson Professor in the Humanities, held until recently by our former colleague, Jonathan Judakin. And as you know, for over a decade, Jonathan hosted fantastic, thought-provoking public programs. Our new Wilson Center will continue to address enduring humanistic questions through events like today's talk. Please mark your calendars for the April 24th conversation with Shelley Lowe. That's the bookmark that you have. Shelley Lowe was the first Native American to run the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the last one. She was just let go a couple of weeks ago, so it will be interesting and I think important to hear her perspective on federal funding for the humanities in the current environment. On campus, the Wilson Center will encourage team teaching, promote student-faculty research, spur innovative work that excavates the human record to scaffold our imagination for possible futures. I'm delighted to announce that we've hired our next Wilson professor, Dr. Gretchen Henderson. Henderson's creative scholarship traverses the humanities and environmental studies. She's currently writing about bodies of water, which makes us very excited to have her join us here on the banks of the Mississippi. The Wilson Center, the Wilson Professor, today's event, all of these are made possible by the generosity of Spence, and he's here with us today, and we can formally thank him now, please. Our speaker today, Dr. Timothy Snyder, embodies the best of the humanities. His authority as a historian is grounded in his immersion in the archives, in his close reading across not one but 10 languages, and in his ethical reflection upon global atrocities. From this historical authority, Snyder's thought ranges freely across the humanities into philosophy, literature, mythology, political theory, religious studies, and public policy. Over the past decade, as many of you know, his expertise in the history of Ukraine has been increasingly in demand, whether in broadcast interviews or in expert testimony to Congress or the United Nations Security Council. In 2018, he published The Road to Unfreedom, which I believe he wrote as a warning, though it seems like some have taken it as a how-to manual. In 2019, a near-death experience led Snyder to reflect upon his own mortality, as well as upon our flawed healthcare system in his memoir, Our Malady. Snyder brings what Dante called the good of intellect to bear upon our current moment. In his words, history does not repeat, but it does instruct. So last summer, when I learned of Snyder's newest book on freedom, I immediately invited him to Rhodes, a liberal arts institution where we practice and hone the intellectual crafts of freedom, where our students cultivate the attention-oriented practices I'd like to tell my students that the liberal arts is not, it's a hard sell as a phrase. It's not the right etymology. Liberal has to do with freedom, and arts have to do with crafts. They have to do with intellectual habits. They have to do with profound activities of the mind. That's what Snyder models for us, and that's what our students attempt to cultivate in their attention-oriented practices that Tocqueville termed the habits of democracy. On Freedom models a mind in pursuit of self-knowledge and induces all of us to think with more care, with more capaciousness about the human condition. These are just habits of mind that have become ever more urgent. Please welcome Timothy Snyder.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see all of you here today on this lovely day. I've already enjoyed my walk, so I've enjoyed Memphis today, and so now I can work and you can take it all in. My premise today, my basic premise, is that we've got freedom wrong in this country and that we are now paying a price. That is my premise. I will speak a bit about how we've got freedom wrong. I'll spend most of my time, though, on trying to explain how we might get freedom right. And my guide, as Scott mentioned, is going to be the notion of habits. Now, we might think that habits and freedom don't go together. We might think that a habit is something that we follow automatically. A habit is something that someone else has instructed us to do, and therefore there must be some tension with freedom. And of course, that can be right. I'm not going to say that every habit is a good habit. I'm going to stay with the idea that what we need are the right set of habits, or to use the language that was offered, just habits. What I'm going to be claiming is that freedom is not, and this is where I think our country is going wrong, and it may be the wrong idea on which our country brings itself to an end. Freedom is not impulse. Freedom is not the thing that you feel like doing at the moment. Freedom isn't just being against the thing that makes you uncomfortable. Freedom has to be positive. It has to be about who you are, what you care about, the things you would actually take risks for, the things you want to bring into the world. So let me start with the first point, which is how we get freedom wrong. And we do. I'm happy to engage with this in Q&A, but I'm not going to do an on the one hand, on the other hand here. Fundamentally, in this country, we talk about freedom, and most of us, most of the time, are getting it wrong. My case is that it's the most important of ideas, and therefore the loss when you get it wrong is all the greater. So how do we get it wrong? We get freedom wrong by thinking about it as negative. We get freedom wrong by thinking about freedom only as the absence of oppression. We get freedom wrong when we convince ourselves that freedom is just about me being against something. And that is the default American way of thinking about freedom. It is so deeply ingrained in our language, in our ways of thinking, that it is quite hard for most Americans even to think about freedom as being anything other than being against or being alone. Now, there are many, many problems with this, and I'm going to try to roll them slowly in front of you, and you can nod with recognition or not, as you prefer. One of the nice things about being the speaker is that you can see all of the reactions, right? So one of the problems with this is that when we think about freedom as being negative, when we think about freedom as being me against things, we never have to ask, am I free? We assume that we're free. We assume that we're free and the problem is on the outside, right? We assume that the problem is some distant foe. The problem is some distant structure. The problem is some enemy. But if we start out by thinking of freedom as negative, as me against the world, what we never have to do is ask, well, wait, was I free? Is the world really the problem? Or really the only problem? Or am I perhaps the problem? So when you start out from negative freedom, you're building in the assumption that everything is okay with you and that you would be a free person if it weren't for those people out there who were oppressing you. And I want to say that for most of us, most of the time, that is not a justified assumption. Or to put it in a better way, if we start from the assumption that we're okay and the problem is just the world, we can't get ourselves free that way. Because even if you solve the problem in the world, you're still left with being yourself. You're still there, right? Relatedly, if we assume that freedom is negative, that it's just me against things, if it's just an oppositional stance, we never have to give the idea of freedom any content. We never have to give it any flesh. We never have to give it any contours or color or humanity, because freedom is just the act of being against something else. We never actually have to ask, well, what does freedom mean? Which I think is a deep, dark question in American English. We use the word all the time in our advertisements, in our slogans, in our political campaigns, all the time, in our breakups. I don't know what it means when you laugh after a second. I need you to either laugh right away or don't laugh. but when it takes a minute, I don't know what to make of that. All right. Maybe that was like some kind of like Tennessee politeness, like, oh, we just realized he was telling a joke. Okay, we're gonna give him the laugh. All right. Okay, now where was I? So so we use the word a lot, but we're not really sure what it means. And for me, freedom is the value of values, just to be clear about where I stand. Freedom is the value of values because I think there are very many good things in the world, and freedom is the condition in which we can judge them, evaluate them, balance them, try to realize them. But we can't get to that idea or any other if we just assume that freedom is us against something else. So if we start from a notion of freedom that's negative, we don't know who we are, we don't think very much about other people, we don't really think much about government, we're just kind of against government, or we want it to be smaller, and we certainly don't think about the earth. We don't think about the conditions, the geological, ecological, atmospheric conditions in which we live, because we're just against things. And if you're just against things, you're not thinking about all the things that made you possible. In politics, where the idea of negative freedom leads, is towards a small, dysfunctional government. If people tell you that freedom is you against the government, well, then what do? We cut taxes, we disable government services, we fire civil servants. We make the government small to the point of being dysfunctional. And of course, when you're able to make the government small to the point of being dysfunctional, in a way you've proven the case. You've shown that government doesn't really work, right? You start from the assumption that we should all be against government, and then you defund government, and you fire the people who are working for government, and then government really doesn't work. And so to speak, you've proven your case. You've proven your case politically. And of course, though, and this is just a word of warning for both all of you nice left-wing and all of you nice or not so nice right-wing anarchists out there, when you remove the government or make it small or dysfunctional, you don't get to start again from a tabula rasa. You don't get to go back to a state of nature. There's no fresh point where you can begin again. There's no Stunde Null. Sorry, I'm just like tossing. It's a moment in the culture where I feel like I can use German. So, yeah, I was on national television the other night, and I said 5 words in a row in German, which I think is a record for American television. But I feel like now, if not now, then when, as the saying goes. Okay, so if you make government small or dysfunctional, the oligarchs are still there. And they are relatively more powerful. And by the way, they were the ones who told you to make government small and dysfunctional in the first place, because they know that in that situation, they will end up being more powerful, and there will be no instrument that can constrain them. And related to the problem of contemporary oligarchy in general is the new problem of digital oligarchy. And the digital part I would like for you to take very seriously. When we say that freedom is just us against something, we are defining ourselves as binary creatures. We're for, we're against, we're for, we're against, we're triggered, we're not. We have an impulse, we don't have an impulse. And that way of being in the world works very nicely together with social media. Now, I realize I'm talking to a lot of nice Rhodes students who don't know what social media is, but there's this thing called TikTok, and okay, I'm not even going to work this joke. The TikTok didn't, okay. But the way that social media is, thank you, there's like one student smiling, thank you. Oh, two, excellent. But the way that social media are set up is precisely to make us function in that way. We're reaffirmed, 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 we're outraged. Reaffirmed, reaffirmed, outraged. Social media is designed to make us function in a binary way. And as we learn to be fleshy algorithms, as we learn to function in that binary way, we move, as it were, organically into a digital world in which we're triggered, not triggered, triggered, not triggered, triggered, not triggered, right? And this is another way in which contemporary oligarchy works, because social media platforms are generally owned by one person. And that one person, or that, the person who owns a platform, is trying to move you in the same direction that the platform is moving you, namely into a politics of us and them. In other words, a politics of fascism. So by these various routes, negative freedom brings us to a politics in which we oppose not just government, but we oppose one another. As government becomes weaker and as we're more dissatisfied, we oppose one another. We've been trained to oppose things. Now the government's gone. Who are we going to oppose? Our neighbors. African Americans, immigrants, trans people, whatever's left. We've been trained to oppose something. We've been learned to call that freedom, and now government is disabled. So what do we do next? We turn ourselves against people. So in all of these ways, negative freedom brings us towards a kind of politics, which I call fascism. People can call different names, but this is how this works. As we look abroad, it's the same story. We are making our government less functional at home, and we're also, by the same logic of negative freedom, breaking up relationships and structures abroad. Until a few weeks ago, the American position in the world largely had to do with relationships, friendships, alliances, formal agreements, things which made the United States more functional. We have chosen to treat those things as the enemy and to treat our former friends as enemies, leading us to a very similar position where all of a sudden it's us against them. Suddenly we're against the Canadians. Yeah, which is, it would be funny if it weren't so horrible, right? It's shameful. Suddenly we're against the Danes, right? Suddenly we're against the people who were once our friends. So that's just by way of saying or making the case that negative freedom is not in fact freedom. It's not in fact freedom. The basic idea that we have about freedom is fundamentally wrong. Now, of course, I'm not saying that we're not sometimes oppressed. Of course, we are sometimes oppressed. And of course, it's right sometimes to resist. But the point of resistance is that it is in the name of the people. It's in the name of the people. The freedom comes not from the barrier. Freedom comes from the people. Okay, so that you can read if you want. You'd have to be a very subtle, penetrating reasoner, but you could understand what I just said as a critique of the present moment. But I want to push this point a little bit further and talk about a moment that took place 3 years ago, which suggests, which gets us to the point of why we think we're already free. Why we think we're already free, or why we think we know so much about freedom. And the basic problem here for me is this. If you think you're already free, you usually have a story about how that freedom was delivered to you. And in America, we have a couple of basic stories about this. The Constitution, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, the Constitution. I'll leave that to others. But the Constitution, our constitutional tradition, does not on its own make us free. American exceptionalism in no form makes us free. On the contrary, if you think you're already exceptional, then you're going to behave badly. always. There are no exceptions to that generalization about exceptionalism. Saying that you're exceptional is always preparation for or the excuse after you've behaved badly. So the tradition, the forefathers, all that stuff, you can't take freedom from them. In fact, that position is an inherently authoritarian one, because if you believe that freedom is coming to you from the past or from the outside in any way, that means that you're not learning the habits, which I'm going to talk more about, but the habits that would lead you to become a free person yourself. The other American story is that freedom comes from capitalism, that it's the free market which allows us to be free people. And that has many, many problems. I would make the point that we should never put the word free in front of anything besides people, and we'll be a lot safer. The notion of a free market itself is, of course, nonsensical. Markets only exist because of property rights, and property rights require government action. And once you understand that, it's all just a question of which government action you want and which one you don't. But more fundamentally here, I'm trying to make the point that if you believe that a market is bringing you freedom, you're taking an authoritarian position, because you're saying someone else out there, some other thing, in this case, a non-existent abstraction, is going to bring you freedom, which means that you yourself are not being a free person. With the free market, it's a little bit worse than that, because with the free market, people say, well, the market has to be free and therefore you can't be. You're not allowed to have health care, right? As soon as someone says free market, they're saying human obligation. So I say free market, that means you can't have good roads. I say free market, that means you can't have good public education. I say free market, that means that you have to have a dysfunctional government. So free market is an authoritarian position. Anyway, my larger point is that our American problem, and now I'm not just talking about the current moment, I'm talking about our American problem in general, is that we tend to think that freedom is being brought to us by something else. And this goes together with the negative freedom mistake, because in the negative freedom mistake, we think, I'm already free. The problem is something outside. Why am I already free? Well, because of some good stuff, the market, the history, capitalism, whatever. The moment, or a moment where this came home to me was in February 2022, which, as you'll remember, was the moment when Russia invaded Ukraine. And you'll probably also remember that in February 2022, the conventional wisdom was that Ukraine will fall immediately, Zelensky will and should flee the country. That is what everybody thought. I mean, everybody within Washington, D.C., and I was in a position to know this, and I was also in a position to be criticized by other people because I was one of the very few people who said, no, actually he'll stay and they'll fight. And this, though, is not about Ukraine. This is about us. Why was it that it was such common sense for Americans that other people would not fight for their freedom? Why was that common sense? And I think the answer runs deep, and it's sad, and it's worth reflecting on, and it's this. If you think freedom is brought to you by outside forces, whatever those outside forces might be, and then the outside forces turn out to be against you, what do? You run. You run. So when the Ukrainians didn't run, we didn't really have a way to process that, did we? It was quite surprising, wasn't it? If you can remember back then. The wisdom was, well, the universe is for you up till the moment it's against you, and then when it's against you, you just turn tail and run like hell. But they didn't. And I was also just very fortunately in a position to talk to many Ukrainians in 2022 and sense about why it was they didn't run. And I want to relate to you a conversation I had with President Zelensky in September of 2022, which is very helpful and which brings us towards this notion of habits. So I asked him directly in a much longer conversation about freedom, why he stayed. And of course, what we want, like as Americans, as viewers of Hollywood movies, what we want is for him to talk about like how he's a big hero, right? We want to hear a story about how, you know, it was obvious to him or something. We want a story about the lone person, right, who reacted to the moment. But the thing he told me was really exactly the opposite. So I asked him a direct question: why didn't you flee Kiev in February 2022? And he started talking about his parents. He started talking about his upbringing. He started talking about choices that his parents had made decades before. He started talking about choices that he had made growing up. He tried to define for me the pattern of his life in the larger setting of his parents and his friends before he even got to the point of this. And then by the time he got to February 2022, remaining in Kiev, what he said was, if I had fled, I wouldn't have been myself. And I think this is very revealing about what freedom, in fact, is. If you think freedom is impulse, if you think freedom is just negative, then of course you're going to run. If it's impulse, you're going to run. The only way you're going to stay in a situation like that is if you have a richer, more robust, more human, more realistic notion of freedom, which is built upon habits. So habits over time create this thing that we call character. And if you have character, sometimes there's only one thing you can do. Does that mean that you're not free? I think on the contrary. I think that's what freedom, in fact, looks like. So let's talk now about freedom and habits. The point that I want to make, and now I'm just going to do a little tiny bit of philosophy. The point that I want to make, and it's Zelensky's point, but I'm just going to make it in a more abstract way. The point that I want to make is that there are virtues. There are good things in the world: loyalty, grace, patience, friendship. There really are good things in the world. These things aren't real the same way that this lectern is real, but they are no less real than this lectern. And that, therefore, freedom is the value of values, or the virtue of virtues, because it's the condition in which we can live among those good things and affirm them and choose them and try to combine them, try to bring them into the world. So freedom, in other words, gets us into a metaphysical space. Freedom can't just be about the physical things in the world. We're not just objects like other objects. What's special about us is that we can be friends, we can love, we can be loyal, we can show integrity. That's what's special about us. That's what makes us different from the rocks in the field. And freedom is when we're in the condition, internally and externally, where we're able to do all those things. So this brings us to the question of habits, because not every habit is going to bring you into that metaphysical space, right? If your habit is that you do what you're told, or your habit is that you stare at your phone, or your habit is that you conform to what everyone else is doing, that's not going to push you into this moral or metaphysical space, right? It's not any old habit. It has to be the habit of believing that values or virtues are real and trying to combine them, trying to bring them into life over time. So just to give you an example, we are confronted all the time with moral choices between values that you cannot actually reconcile. So for example, spontaneity is a good thing. Who would disagree, right? Spontaneity is great. But punctuality also good, right? And so like if you're a university professor, you would like to celebrate the spontaneity of your students, but you really also want them to be in class on time. And there's no way, you can't reduce that, right? You can't, there's no way to compromise. They're just both good. And so as a human, you have to make a judgment about where, when, and how. Loyalty and honesty. It's good to be loyal to your friends. And then sometimes you have to be honest to your friends, and sometimes to be loyal you have to be honest, but not always. Not always. You're making choices. Mercy and consistency. Consistency is good in general, but most of us would probably think mercy is a good thing. But mercy is by definition making an exception. If you're merciful, you're always inconsistent. So as humans, we live in this moral universe in which there really are good things, and there's no easy way you can't make them all one good thing. You're constantly making these choices. And so we live in that just as much as we live in a physical environment. It's around us all the time. And having the habit of affirming and choosing among conflicting virtues is a habit that can lead you to be free. If you do that over the course of time, then you become a kind of person who is prepared to confront difficult situations and can react to them in a way which is in fact your own as a free person. All right, so there is a political implication to this, which I just want to pause on for a moment. So I've been talking about this as though you can do this on your own, but you can't do it on your own. It's impossible to do this kind of thing on your own. In order to become the kind of person who can have these habits, it would really help to be around other people who have these habits. It would really help to be around institutions which affirm these habits. And when I say institutions, I not only mean fine institutions of higher education, like the one we have the pleasure to be in today, I mean institutions all the way down to, and indeed especially, early childhood development. Because the thing that I'm talking about as metaphysical or as moral is also sociological and even neurological. It has to do with how we educate ourselves from the very beginning, and especially at the very beginning. Now, if that's true, then you realize, and I'm talking to all you parents out there, or people who are thinking about becoming parents, to which I say, wait now until you hear what I say first. But you can, there was at least one person who was like, oh, okay, I'm going to start listening to this lecture right now. So the things that a baby needs in order to, so I think like serious philosophy begins with birth. If it doesn't have birth in it, it's not serious philosophy, and that is a very useful way to filter the field, because it means you don't have to read 99.9% of the stuff. Socrates rescues himself very late by mentioning that his mother had been a midwife. Like, he catches it at the last second, right? But in general, most of philosophy doesn't have childbirth in it. Just say goodbye, forget it. Doesn't have childbirth in it, it's not serious. So we have, I'm completely serious about that. Okay, I'm gonna open up a little parenthesis here. The whole negative freedom model assumes that you are already a rational adult who knows yourself and has interests. That doesn't happen at all, ever, but if it happens, it doesn't happen on its own. You can't leave out the question of how the squalling, covered in blood newborn became that rational person who knows it's usually his own interests. If you leave that out, it's not a serious account. So what I'm trying to say is that this involves politics. Because if children need attention and time in order to become the kinds of humans, the kinds of creatures who can develop these habits, where does that attention and time come from? It cannot come from just the parents. That is impossible. It cannot be done. And now I can tell who out here is a parent. It's like the people who are like both tired and nodding. Yes, I'm with you. So it cannot be done by just the parents. And this is one of the ways where our society goes wrong, right? It's one of the ways where America lets people down, because we say freedom, 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 taboo on childbirth, have a child, and then just see how free you are. Right, from that moment, and how free the child is from that moment. The talking about freedom negatively and taboo on childbirth go together. They go together. Because negative freedom assumes, it blanks out, it abstracts from, it pushes away all of the considerations that it actually takes to make a person free. It assumes that somehow you just are free and the problem is somebody else, right? It leaves out all these human and therefore political questions of how we create ourselves to become free individuals. And so there's a politics to this, and the politics says government is justified insofar as government creates the conditions in which we can grow up to become free people, something like that. You can't say, as negative freedom does, that all government is bad. That's ridiculous. It's also ridiculous to say any form of government is okay. A way to legitimate government is by saying, well, government is the only way you can have organized childcare in a big society. You can't do that without government. You can't have public schools without government. You can't have roads without government. All of these things which we require for freedom, once you think about freedom positively, you need government for. So there's a politics to this. And this politics can also be defined as a habit, because if we think, like what I've just said as a principle, you could also think of as a check. Is the thing that this government is doing creating conditions for freedom or not, right? That's a check, that's a habit. But it's also a habit of thinking about freedom in terms of other people. So like in Vienna, where I sometimes live, I have a friend who was, this is just an anecdote, but a new subway station was being built. And he said, like, when that subway station is built, I'll be a little bit more free. And that's true, he will be, but that's not a way that we're used to thinking about things. We're used to thinking freedom is when I get to do something, right? Like if it was the Timothy Snyder subway station, then yeah, right? That's the American way, sponsored by, right? But he is thinking, he actually said, like, I'm happy to pay taxes for the subway station because I'll be more free. But of course, 2 million other people in Vienna will also be more free. And what's wrong with that? So the habit is thinking about freedom in terms of institutions and political activity that allows everybody to be more free, right? So, for example, parental leave makes everybody more free, right? Vacation makes everybody more free. We're trained to think, I'm going to have vacation like 7 years after I'm dead, like that's the American way, right? I'm going to work hard, I'm going to work really, really, really hard, and then I'm going to die. I'm going to put in my time being dead. And then I'm going to get that long weekend I've been dreaming about. That's the American way. And we've been trained to think about that as freedom, right? Like I'm going to hustle, I'm going to struggle, I'm going to struggle, I'm going to hustle, and then eventually I'll have like that really good job that lets me have some vacation. But like, what if you just had a law that said everybody gets 6 weeks of vacation, right? How about that? And then everybody would be more free. And don't say that would make us poorer, because all the countries that are richer than we are have 6 weeks of vacation. So give me a break, right? So that it's a habit of thinking of freedom as things that work for everybody. Because when you think about freedom as just things that work for you, you end up becoming less free. Okay, so a couple more points about habits, and then we'll bring this to a close. The habit which is at the bottom of all of this, which I draw from a really interesting German-Jewish philosopher, or Jewish-German philosopher called Edith Stein. The habit which is at the bottom of all this is empathy. You cannot do freedom without empathy. Our negative freedom tradition says, I'm fine, I'm free, the problem is on the outside, right? It's the government, it's the other people, whatever, but I'm fine. I don't need you to tell me anything about myself, right? That's us. And that's a problem, because I'm going to reveal a big secret now. We don't actually know ourselves that well. And we can't know ourselves that well all by ourselves. If you're just with yourself, or worse, if you're just staring at the screen, you are constantly, I'm sorry, this is going to be like breaking a lot of hearts now, but you're lying to yourself all the time, or there are things that you don't see, and if you're on the computer is feeding back to you affirmation of things you already think, which, again, not to break any hearts, are usually wrong. So the whole notion of being free, whether it's my notion or the negative freedom notion, assumes that you know yourself. Right? They would say you know your own interests. I would say you know your own virtues or values. But it assumes you know yourself. You can't do that on your own. It's not possible. We all walk through life with huge bits of metaphysical shaving cream on our faces, or if that was too male-centric, metaphysical spinach between our teeth, right? There are things that are wrong with us that we will never find out about unless we trust other people. And the only way to trust other people, and this is now Edith Stein's argument, is to recognize them as people, as humans, corporeally, physically. To recognize they began at birth, that they will end at death, that we can all be ill, that we're all frail, to recognize that we all inhabit space in a certain way. And if we can do that, can be empathetic in that deep way, then we're able to listen about ourselves. And if we can listen about ourselves, then we have a chance of becoming the person who develops the right habits. So like empathy is the habit, I think, which enables all of the other habits. So Edith Stein makes this argument, and I think it's very powerful, that the knowledge that we need for freedom begins with acknowledging the reality of the other person. And that's not easy. That's hard. I mean, those of you who are in favor of empathy know that it's hard. Nobody thinks empathy is easy, but freedom's not easy, right? The negative freedom story is a shortcut. It says, you're fine, go take down the government, things will be great for you after that. You know, negative freedom, and this is important actually, negative freedom, it takes advantage of the fact that we're not self-critical. Negative freedom tells you big stories, and one of them is, if you take down the government, everything will be great. That's a big story. It's not true. Like, it's a big lie, in fact, right? Negative freedom takes advantage of the fact that we think we already know ourselves. Negative freedom hunts down our vulnerabilities and tells us the big lies that we want to hear. And then we become, watch this move, kids, then we become non-player characters in somebody else's game, right? The only way not to be a non-player character in somebody else's game is to know who you are. Then you have a chance of having your own virtues, your own truths, and staying out of the big lies. Okay, final point that I want to make is about what resistance looks like, or what it means to push up against the world. Because of course we do have to push up against the world. And here again, I'll start with the problem with negative freedom. In negative freedom, the notion is that you fight something and you destroy it, right? That's the way, if you think of the stories, the movies, that's the way it always is. So a bad thing's on the horizon and you destroy it. But in reality, the constraints that we face are very often not like that. The constraints that we face are things that we have to be able to turn to our own purposes. And negative freedom doesn't let you do that because it only gives you the option of total resistance. And it also doesn't tell you, and this is just as important, what your purposes are. So very often what we actually have to be able to do is to turn things to our own purposes. And turning things to our own purposes requires the moral habit that I talked about knowing what your purposes are. But it also requires the habit of knowledge, the habit of learning how the world actually works. So I'll give you an example which is all around us, which is global warming, right? There just are, here comes my conservative moment. I'm talking about reality again. There just are laws of physics, which one can explain, which get you to why global warming is happening. It just is the case that there are physical reactions, which you can think of as chemical, but physical reactions, which mean that there is human-caused global warming. That just is the case. And if you recognize that, you can also recognize that solar and fusion and wind and lots of other things could get us out of this problem. In other words, if you know the science, you see the problem, and the problem is a constraint, right? You can't just, you can't bring magic into it. You can't wave a wand and solve global warming. But the very things that cause the problem are also the key to the solution, right? The knowledge that you have. And the point that I want to make is that this is true at a very fundamental level. The things that we're able to do are what make us free. But all the things that we're able to do have to do with constraints. Gravity. So another philosopher who's very important in my book my book on freedom is Simone Weil, who has the idea, she had a collection of essays she wrote during the Second World War. I should have said, by the way, that all the philosophers I'm talking about today were philosophers of war, or thinkers. Zelensky in the big war we have now, Edith Stein. Edith Stein got her idea about corporeal empathy from being a nurse in the Great War, in the First World War. As she was treating the ruined bodies of men, that's when she got the idea of what it meant to understand someone else and therefore to have knowledge of oneself. It was that experience of the Great War. And so Simone Weil, during the Second World War, wrote some essays which she left behind after her death in 1943, which were collected and published under the title of Gravity and Grace. And in that Gravity and Grace is I think, a very important notion of how you turn things to your purposes. Because, of course, gravity is a restraint. None of you, I'm checking, is going to float upwards right now. We're all constrained by gravity. And yet, gravity is also what allows us to walk. Walking is a management of gravity. Gravity is what allows us to dance. Gravity is what allows us to play games. When we throw a baseball, which is an example I use in the book because I played baseball, but it's also an example that Simone Weil uses. When we throw a ball, we are interacting with gravity. We're taking a constraint and we're turning it to our purposes. Simone Weil, for this, used the idea of habitude, habit, right? That there are practices, as we practice with constraints, we learn to turn them to our purposes. We know what our purposes are, and as we practice with our bodies and with our minds, with other people, we learn to turn those constraints into capacity. And here, Edith Stein, the other philosopher I was citing, echoes her. Edith Stein says, the creation of capacity belongs to freedom. We're only free to do the things that we know how to do. And then I'll repeat Zelensky one more time, speaking about his own habits, how they led him to a point where it was clear that there was one thing that he could do another thing. I would not have been myself. So to repeat my case, I think there are right and wrong answers to important questions. I think there's a right and a wrong way to think about freedom. I've tried to show that the negative way of thinking about freedom, which is absolutely dominant in the United States, is not only philosophically or logically indefensible, but politically terrible. And I think quite literally the idea which could lead to the destruction of this republic. I've tried to make the argument that the way to think about freedom positively has to do with habits, not just any habits, but just habits, good habits, habits that push you over the line into thinking about the metaphysical and the moral, that get you better at juggling, combining, affirming the various good things in life. That these habits, that the point of these habits is they get you across from that line, one way and the other, from the good into the real back into the good. And so what follows from this, of course, is that freedom is possible. It's possible to understand it. It's possible to affirm it. It's possible even to imagine a politics of freedom. All these things are possible. This is not where we are now, but we too are never going to succeed just by being against things. You can't succeed even by being against the people who are against everything. At some point, you have to be for something. And being for something isn't just a grand gesture. It isn't just one courageous act. Being for something is a matter of thinking and doing about what's right and what's wrong. In other words, it has to, among other things, be about the courage of having habits. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right, first off, I want to thank Tim for writing to a title that was not his title. I gave him the title, and so that was very generous of him
Well,
to.
no, you heard me at the end. It's all about constraints.
Productive constraints.
You take those
Yes.
constraints. Yeah.
The beauty of working within constraints. We gathered a number of questions in advance from people who submitted them when they registered online, and as well as students who submitted questions, and colleagues and friends and neighbors. So I'll try to synthesize a cluster of them as best as I can. There was a large cluster of questions that came partly following from what you're saying about habit in relationship to education. We have a lot of educators here. We have college professors, college students. We have high school educators, primary school educators, people who are parents who care about education, and grandparents. So can you give us a kind of way to think through maybe like the stages of education for freedom at some key moments in life? I know you've thought about this with your own parenting as well, but if you want to kind of give us an example of what education for freedom looks like at the primary, secondary, and university level, and then we can leave. That would be the solution here.
Well, that's probably a more promising place to start than my own parenting. Let me try to assimilate that to the framework that I use in the book, which is something that I think I understand, and which I think maybe comes a little bit analytically prior to questions about like pedagogy. In the book, I start out with the philosophical part, so I make the case that virtues are real and you have to combine them and so on. And then at the end, I do the political part of what a government like this would in fact look like. And in the middle, there are 5 what I call forms of freedom, which have to do with the connection between the philosophical and the political, or the philosophical and the social. They're the ways that we, given the kinds of beings that we are, could become free. And the first 3 of them are in chronological order in a life, and they bear on this question. The first one is sovereignty. And sovereignty, so sovereignty usually is about the state, and I'm trying to take the word and make it mean something completely different. By sovereignty, what I mean is the capacity of a very young person to learn to make the kinds of choices that I've been talking about. And that capacity is within all of us, but it requires a lot of contact, a lot of effort, a lot of play, a lot of other things to bring it out, a lot of time above all. And what we can tell from and there are probably people out here who are actually specialists on this, but what I could read from the literature on early childhood development instructed me that the first 5 years were very, very important for all of this. And so one answer to the question would be that we should be loading a lot more money, time, prestige, everything in the first 5 years. That's not directly about how we might think of education, but it's parental leave, vacation, more vacation weeks a year, but also flexibility and scheduling, like all the things that allow parents, but also other people to have time with very small children. Like I think that's the basis of everything else. And then the next form of freedom I call unpredictability. And I didn't talk about this in this talk because I was trying to make my own point about constraints and freedom, which I hope I did. The whole time I was operating under a constraint, as Scott generously pointed out. And so, maybe something came out of it, right? Like maybe something came out of it. So for me, unpredictability is the most important category. I don't think that our rationality is what makes us free, at least not in the narrow sense. I think what makes us free is that we're unpredictable. Not unpredictable in the sense of just random, but unpredictable in the sense that the values that we bring, the values that we bring into our actions are not predictable. So in these dilemmas that I mentioned, very simple ones that I mentioned before, like a clash between loyalty and honesty, all of you are going to handle that in different ways. And that's not actually predictable. And there's no way to reduce those moral clashes into some kind of like classical physics or arithmetic. You just can't do it. You can't say that when loyalty and honesty run into each other, loyalty knocks honesty away, or you can't say loyalty is greater than honesty. They're just different. They're both good, but they're different. And that irreducible difference, and then the way that allows us to make new combinations morally, that makes the universe unpredictable. Like that is our capacity for unpredictability that we push out. And by the way, just to make the opposite point, this is why the algorithms on social media are designed, or one of the reasons, why they're designed to make you predictable. Because when you're predictable, you won't be free. When you're predictable, people will see what you're literally in somebody else's story when you're predictable. And that's by design. That's not a side effect. So what follows from this is that we want to be very careful about the digital stuff. I mean, this is an obvious point, but we want to make sure that we're treating children, and here the book is about kind of ages 5 to 15, that we're allowing them the chance to have access to human unpredictability, which means, by the way, and this is going to, I promise I won't get more conservative than this, books. It means books. The most unpredictable thing, yeah. I mean, we know we've reached a pretty pass in our civilization when all you have to do is say books and everybody claps, Like, here we are, man. If I want to bring the house down, I say public library. But the point is that books really are unpredictable. Like literature is really unpredictable. You're thrown into somebody else's world of values according to conventions that you don't completely understand. So in a shelf of fiction in the public library, there is much more unpredictability than the entire internet, right? Than in the entire internet. At least as the internet is brought to you. Like I realize there's some of you who know how to navigate and can, but in the way the internet is presented to us, I can tell you in advance. Like if I get to know you a little bit, I can tell you in advance what the algorithms are going to bring you. But if you go to the library today and just pick out a novel, I don't know what novel it's going to be. I don't know what's going to bring to you, right? But it's going to bring something. And so the lesson of unpredictability is you have to make sure that the kids physically are in spaces with books. So I'm against computers in the classroom, 100% against. I don't think there should be any screens in any classrooms in the United States, except in classes, except for, there are disability exceptions, of course, but the main exception would be programming, because I think it's really important to establish the agency of the child over the machine. And so if the child is taught how to program, how to code, then you're establishing you're answering the Godot Cavo question, like whom. The child is the agent, and the machine is the instrument, right? But other than that, I do not think there should be screens in schools. I think that was the whole thing was a big mistake. And just by the way, just a little anecdote: all the people, I don't think there are any exceptions to this. Like all of the Silicon Valley oligarchs who have children. And you can tell me an exception if you know one, but in my anecdotal knowledge, they all send their kids to schools without screens. But think about that for just a moment, right? Like, because they know what they have done, and they don't want to do it to their own children. So I would go much harder on like the corporeal, the books, keeping the screens out, except insofar as the screens serve a purpose. And again, anecdotally, I've talked to teachers, and again, there are many probably here, but I've talked to teachers in school districts where at least the phones and stuff have been thrown out, and generally, at least when that can be enforced, the response is overwhelmingly positive. And while I'm on anecdotes, I banned digital stuff in my classrooms in 2006, and it's had a really positive effect. Grades are higher, but also I can now say, now that this is almost 20 years ago, it means that the kids who took my classes still remember what they learned. Okay? Because the depressing thing about the screen is that you don't actually learn from it, because you can in the very short term, but what your mind does with the screen is that it learns that the screen is a kind of permanent accessory, and so it doesn't actually have to encode, because it's always going to be there, right? It's like, I realize the Stegosaurus doesn't really have two brains, so please nobody correct me, but it's like the Stegosaurus with the second brain, like you think, oh, my real brain doesn't have to learn this because my Stegosaurus brain down there is going to handle all of this. That's how your mind handles it if you have a screen next to you all the time. So anyway, unpredictability requires, I think, a lot of discipline about time and about bodies. And then the third, these may not be as down in the details as you want, but I'm doing my best. The third form of freedom is mobility. by which I mean physical and social mobility. So that we have to have schools where kids can leave their parents. We have to have public schools that kids can afford to go to. We have to give them that chance to get physically somewhere else, and then not to be financially disabled at the end of it. Okay, that was a long answer, which may not have been as detailed as you wanted, but I need to stop. You can ask again.
That's great. One of the things that a number of people remarked upon in the book is your facility with languages and the way that you're often leaning into helping us think through the history of a word or the meaning of the word, or the fact that a different language tradition actually has two synonyms for the same word that we have in English. So you do that with thinking about the different words for body in German, or you also are very careful about, with the focus of the book, on freedom and not on liberty. Can you talk about why you care about the words that we use and why those kinds of distinctions make political sense for you to be insisting upon? We don't understand what the word freedom means, or we need to think about these two different senses of the word body, or another language has the word unfreedom in it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think when we're in our normal impatient American mode, we dismiss discussions of words as just semantics. But of course, there is no just semantics. I mean, semantics are incredibly important because words, if we take them seriously, lead our minds to particular places where they wouldn't be able to go otherwise. And so what a particular word in English means, what words it's neighbors with, where it comes from, what else it suggests, which authors used it, all of those things are liberating because they stretch us. Words increase capacity. The more words we're comfortable with, the more we can say, the more we can communicate to others, but also the more unpredictable we can be, which goes back to the books, by the way. The way that people acquire a large active vocabulary is by reading books, not by way of the internet. I mean, I know all 10 words that come from the internet because I have a teenage boy. So I know all 10 of them. I can but but books actually, and I shouldn't knock on. He reads, right? He reads books. I'm sure he's reading a book right now, as we're speaking. But it's the reading which gives you the active vocabulary, which makes words into your friends that you feel comfortable using, that come out of you at certain moments without you having to think about them. Words stretch you in this way, and then they also stretch your interlocutors as your interlocutors try to meet you halfway. And then the foreign languages. I mean, when you're in a foreign language, you're a slightly different person because there's no, despite Google Translate, there's no perfect overlap between any one word and any other word in a different language. It doesn't map on. I mean, even the very simple words like one and two, like French has a word, seconde, which means two in a series of two. We don't have that, right? We have second, but is there a third or not? Well, French tells you there isn't. Seconde. Deuxième, maybe there's more. And even the most simple things, I think, have different, like they're laden with different things. If I say eins, zwei, drei in German, I think that really does mean something different, right? Maybe I didn't say it right, okay? But it means something different than if you say un, deux, trois, I think. I think it suggests something very different. And I think even uno, dos, tres, I think even those very basic things, and if it's true about numbers, it's true about everything else. And when you're inside a different language, then sometimes that brings you tools you can come back with and chop away at your own cliches with. And that's what I'm trying to do a little bit in the book, as you generously recognized. Edith Stein used the semi-archaic and more archaic now than then word Leib to talk about the body. And it's an amazing word because when we say body, okay, body, but a body can also be, a body can be anything really. It could be a human body, but it could also be a body of water. It can be any kind of physical body. It could be alive, it could be dead. It can be, a technical term. Whereas in German they have Körper, which means body, more or less in that sense, a human body, but also other things. But then there's the word Leib, and Leib only means a human body or maybe an animal body, or it could be the body of an invented creature in a story. And a Leib has the sense of going outward, right? Things come from within the Leib and they go outwards. Things like emotions or feelings or values, right? And that makes the Leib different from a body. So the word Leib means body, but it means a very specific thing. And she used that in her philosophy. And so I used it in my book as well. Because if you take something which is strange, like Leib, and you push it into your own language, then you can do something with it. Maybe you can get people to see something about the body that they wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And then freedom, one has to be very attentive to cliche. Freedom is it's such a struggle because you're starting from a word which is so often used. And it's so heavy, in my view, with cliche and overuse. It's a word people usually use to exclaim or to yell at each other with. But I think it's inescapable. I think you can't get around that word because I really do think it's not just politically but also philosophically. You can't do without it. And you asked why freedom. Freedom for me, like freedom, the dumb in it brings you something that liberty doesn't. So it's like kingdom, it's like a domain, right? So when I'm thinking of freedom, dome also means home in Slavic languages. Okay, that Slavic language lesson over. But dome carries a whole series of associations which have to do with order or with land or with a house, right? A dominion. And so freedom is not an abstraction for me. Freedom is a place, a set of relationships where people are free. So that's why I went with freedom.
Can you speak to to bring us to the kind of current political moment in education and higher education in particular? Obviously, great anxiety among international students and faculty and staff who some have been abducted recently based on what nominally should be free speech acts that they've made. Can you speak to freedom in the current scene in higher education?
Oh, thank you. I'll try to say a few things. I'm sure they won't be adequate to meet this moment. Number one is that, and I think I tried to make this case in the talk, institutions of higher education are on the side of freedom. We are the factories of freedom. We help people to become more free, and we have to own that language. We can't let that language go. We can't let the people who are repressing us have the language of freedom. I think we have to own the language of freedom. We have to associate our tasks, whether we're in the humanities or the sciences or the social sciences, it doesn't really matter here. Insofar as we're creating capacity, we're creating mobility, we're creating future choices for people, we're opening up people's eyes to values they might not have seen before. We're in the business of freedom. That's what we do. We're in the business of freedom. And I think we have to, I'm not saying we'll win if we do this. I'm just saying, well, it'll make our chances a little bit better. But I think it's also just right. We can't let that go. Second point I want to make about this is, and it's more a point to institutions like Yale than it is to institutions like Rhodes College, but it's a general point. Freedom involves solidarity. That's the fifth form of freedom in my book is solidarity. And universities, colleges, institutions of higher education, we're going to get picked off one by one unless we act together. We have to find a way of acting together. University presidents, college presidents have to act together. You get the point immediately. There's no one institution that can do this on its own. And also we have to feel that the university presidents, university administrators, college presidents, administrators have to feel that other people are at their back, that other people will help them out. And this also is going to involve the rich, and some of this is going on. This is not meant as a total critique, but it's going to involve richer institutions helping less rich institutions. It's going to involve some people taking hits. Some of us are going to take hits for this. So we're going to have to do this together, and that's true of universities. It's also true of other institutions as well. Law firms, other institutions are going to have to try to stick together. We're going to have to do a better job of that. Third thing is that we can use our analytical tools to talk about what's going on. So, for me personally, I wrote a couple articles about this, but the idea that the federal government is going after Columbia because of anti-Semitism, I'm sorry, that's grotesque. It's meant to be grotesque. They do not mean it. What they are doing is they're trivializing the whole notion of anti-Semitism when they do that. I'm not saying that no anti-Semitic things happened at Columbia or at Yale for that matter. Of course they did. But the idea that you're going to go after a university to protect Jews is historically nonsensical. There are not historical examples of people who go after universities because they care about Jews. That's not how it works, people. It's never been like that, and it's not like it right now. If you're on the side of Jews also, you don't deport Muslims, right? And I don't mean that just as a moral point I mean it also as a practical point, because if you care about Jews, you're not going to use the federal government, the power of the federal government, to take people who committed no crimes but who happen to be Muslim or from certain countries and deport them. That is not helping. You don't do that to help the Jews. You also don't create the impression that the federal government is on the side. These things are not being done. In Colombia, right? Colombia is 22% or 23% Jewish. Taking $450 million away from Colombia is not going to benefit those Jewish students. It's just not. So we have to be able to, in the humanities especially, we have to be able to analytically take these things apart before that framings like this. Because the idea that the government has a task force on anti-Semitism is completely absurd. It does not. It is a task force to foment anti-Semitism. That's what it's there for. And we need to be able to use our analytical tools to say that. Okay. And then obviously, okay, on the students who are being deported, I want to say that this is very specifically an act of terror. That of course, we're violating the First Amendment of the Constitution. Everybody on the territory of this country is protected equally by the First Amendment. Everybody, citizens or not, we're all protected. That's just not just common sense, it's also a long body of precedent. And so we are violating our own Constitution when we deport people because they write op-eds or protests or whatever it might be. But the way that we are doing it is a conscious act of terror. You can revoke somebody's visa and you can tell them that their visa has been revoked, and then they can get on a plane and go home. When you choose on the streets of Boston, Massachusetts, or wherever else to physically overcome a person, put them in a car, and send them to a facility in Louisiana, you are consciously carrying out a policy of terror. And we have to recognize that that's what it is and call it by name. And of course, we also have to show solidarity with these students and with the professors who are going to be next, who are already next. We have to treat them as our own, even if we can't always physically stop it, which I think, in some cases, we probably physically can. But even if we can't stop it, we have to treat everyone as ours, and that's part of having a professional ethical identity. That being a university is something which goes beyond citizenship, non-citizenship, country, not country. It also involves a set of professional ethics that we're going to treat our people as our people. That's the best I can do.
So if I understand it correctly, On Freedom grew out in part from responses to people who had read On Tyranny, that they were asking you to make the positive case, not just the defensive negative case against tyrannies, but the thing that we're fighting for. I know a number of people who have been rereading On Tyranny recently, and I think it's distressing for many people that something that looked like a kind of abstraction a decade ago seems like it's more happening right now. And I'm wondering if we had a couple of questions about if you could offer us examples of historical examples of democracies that were threatened with authoritarianism but were able to arrest it, because you do speak in the On Freedom book about some democracies that fell into authoritarianism. But can you give us some inspiration of societies that were able to defend themselves and to have a more robust democratic freedom?
No, that's not that that's a hard question. I'm still thinking about the previous question. There's also, the people on the analytic critique, and like the anti-Semitism thing, you got to also think about who's in the, like who is actually running our government. Like the idea that those people are concerned about anti-Semitism is absurd. We can't let those framings, we can't let framings like that just become normal. Okay, I was just dwelling like the levels. I get stuck in my own levels of absurdity. So yes, okay. So I'm just going to note the funny thing about asking that question in America. The funny thing about asking that question in America is that, and again, like I'm sure whoever asked it is very sophisticated and didn't mean it this way, but it's like saying, well, America's always been a democracy, and now suddenly we're facing this problem. Whereas in fact, all of the US history is full of examples like this, where we became more democratic or less democratic. I mean, I'm going to give you some foreign examples, but, and I'm going to be more comfortable when I do, because I'm not a historian of the US, but the U.S. history, like we're in as part of the country which used to be much less democratic and now is more democratic but becoming less democratic, right? That's the history of American states. A lot of them is becoming less democratic, more democratic, less democratic. And so we don't really have to look abroad. We can say, okay, well, how did the civil rights movement work? Because that was an example of states becoming more democratic. And it wasn't so terribly long ago or so terribly far away, right? So I just want to question, I'm going to give examples, but I just want to question the idea that one even has to look outside the United States for this, because the assumption is, well, we're facing something new. And we are facing something new on a federal level, I guess, but we're not facing something new as a country. Okay, so Poland 2023. That was a country where, had the election gone the other way, that would probably be, certainly would be a system of electoral authoritarianism, where you have an opposition party, but they're never going to win. 2023 was the last chance that the opposition in Poland could win. Okay, your next question is, how'd they do it? Lots of personal politics, lots of door-to-door stuff, very broad coalitions among people who didn't necessarily agree on everything. So anyway, they did pull it back. Patience was another key. Slovenia very recently, although that could flip back the other direction. The entirety, almost the entirety of Europe after much of Europe after 1945. So all of these nice European democracies that our policy is now apparently to invade and destroy, but all of these nice European democracies, they had pretty much all failed by 1938. Pretty much. I mean, there's some minor exceptions like Czechoslovakia, but which was then dismantled. But in general, democracy was discredited in Europe by 1939. It wasn't just that there was a war. Like, in a way, the war makes the story cleaner than it is, but democracy and liberalism and parliamentarism had been discredited by 1939 Europe. And yet, a whole bunch of those states came back, admittedly after a war, but they came back. So, there are examples. And that's, I mean, I don't think it's not that we're in this unprecedented situation. I think, though, that connecting it to On Tyranny is really important, though. And that's the shortcoming of On Tyranny, is you have to be able to imagine not just not going back. You have to imagine and this is why I wrote On Freedom, you have to imagine the better country that you're going to, right? Like nobody's going to say, let's bring back, nobody's going to say, let's bring back September of 2024, right? Nobody's going to, okay, maybe okay, all right. I had a good September too. But, in general, you can't win by like, let's go back to before COVID, or, let's go back to before the financial crisis. You can't do it that way. You have to say, not that we're going to restore democracy in America. That's not going to work for a whole bunch of people, right? And not just, I mean, there's the African-American objection to that, but there's also the objection of lots of people who say, well, that democracy didn't work very well for me in one way or another, right? And many of them have a really solid point. And so you have to say, this is the better thing we're getting to, the better thing we're going towards.
And then one last question that draws from both the beginning and the end of the book, where you reflect upon your childhood in relationship to the bicentennial of the 1776 Declaration of Independence. In some ways, it sounds like your relationship to 1976 was a dawning of your historical awareness, And then you talk at the end of the book about looking forward to 2076 and what your children might be thinking about at that time. But more proximately, next year, 2026, is the 250th anniversary, and that anniversary is already being shaped by the presidency, who has encouraged the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities to redirect funds for their vision of how we should celebrate 1776. Do you have advice on how an institution might look ahead to looking back at the Declaration as the anniversary comes up?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I want to thank you for all of your thoughtful questions. If I don't have another chance to do so, I really appreciate it. The president a couple of days ago issued one of his executive orders, and the executive orders, by the way, are a really good example of how the humanities can help, because there's a lot of parsing to be done about what the word order means, for example. So a lot of the press covers Mr. Trump's executive orders as though like he actually has the fiat power to do the things that are in the executive orders. And it's a mishmash. Like sometimes he orders things that he can order, but much of the time he's ordering things that he can't in fact order. An executive order the president is the executive, and the things that he can do are on the basis of laws that already exist. So he can direct the civil service to emphasize something rather than another thing, but he can't do things that are not in law. And he can't do things, at least not legally, that involve contravening laws. And a lot of the way that we've talked about this, and these are the kinds of things that I did worry a lot about in On Tyranny, with Be Kind to the Language and so on. A lot of the way we talk about this has been also, just to quote the first lesson, it's been obeying in advance. Like he says something, and then we give him the power to do the thing that he says when he didn't have it before we said it. And this is really, this has been really unfortunate, because these executive orders, they're performances, but they're also trials. Like how much of this will we actually swallow? So, recent, as many of you in this room will know, a recent executive order concerned truth in history or something like this. Do you remember? Does anybody remember the title, the exact title? But the basic idea was like returning truth to American history, and it has all the obvious problems. Yeah, it has all the obvious problems, which is all the things that they teach you in history preschool. That. You can't let the president say what the truth of history is. There's never any final truth to history. The government is always, especially as it becomes authoritarian, going to treat history as a reservoir of past innocence of the people who are currently in power. That's what they're going to mean by history, which is not only not true, it's just incredibly boring. It's just incredibly boring to look around the world and see every single authoritarian regime or aspiring to do exactly the same thing. Our people used to be innocent, and then these other people came, and since then it's been bad. And now it's time, to return to that. It's it's always the same. There's no authoritarian government which ever says, my people, we made some mistakes. It doesn't. And it's always the same boring thing. And the boringness in a way is the point, because history is fantastically interesting, right? The way things actually happen at the level of a city or a state or a family, incredibly interesting. Humans are incredibly interesting if we're allowed to peel off the myths about how we were always good and the other side was always bad. It's always that, right? Nobody ever stands up and says, oh yeah, by the way, in the 18th century, the other side was good and we were bad. It never happens, right? It's always the same stupid story. But history itself is incredibly interesting. And that's where I would try to land on this, that obviously Trump's going to try to make it a pageant of what, the founding fathers and, their white wigs or whatever. But but we have to, okay, one laugh in the whole room on that one. But it's going to be a pageantry of a certain story of American innocence. And anybody who doesn't believe in that story is going to be told that what they're doing is lying and not really history. And I think it's also important not just to react to that, really important, and not just say like, well, there's an official project and it's wrong, and so therefore we're going to do a local project that's the opposite. I think it's really important to try to sit on the richness of it, and do studies of 1776, which allow us to see the problematic things of American history, but not, I mean, in my view, in a way, not by saying like, here's a problematic thing, here's a problematic thing, here's a problematic thing, but instead focus on, okay, this is what the settlement was actually like. Here's who the settlers on this boat actually were. Here's what they did afterwards. And then slavery and indentured servitude and native populations come into it, and you see it in a way which is interesting, as opposed to, too pedagogically overdetermined, which we sometimes, I think, do. So not to get caught in like the story of good and bad, or like definitely not be like, well, Trump says that history was this way, but let me add some footnotes. That's where you really don't want to be. You don't want to be adding the footnotes. What you want to be doing is like, and especially since we have a little time, is to think up interesting ways of doing this. Interesting ways which bring people into history, not to counter what he's doing. I mean, what he's doing has to be countered, obviously. It has to be faced up to directly. But I think those of us who have a chance to think about 250 years of the United States should try to focus on the richness and the color and the unpredictability, and bring in the troubling issues and also the non-troubling issues, the spectacular things, but bring them in like thematically. Think about how we're going to do this thematically. That would be my basic guess.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, yeah.